This is the second and last part of the lesson about the British model of government and its influence from the 16th to the 18th century. In the previous part we saw how after some crisis the British constitutional monarchy established itself firmly in Britain at the end of the 17th century. And now in the second part we will see how this British model proved successful, but in fact it proved largely successful at the expense of Britain in its colonies of North America. The first point we need to look at is the idea of enlightenment. Here we are going to talk about the spreading of new ideas conveyed by some intellectuals that were pretty important in Britain and whose principles spread very successfully. So what we can clearly state is that in Britain, more than in any European state during the 17th and 18th century, there was a greater freedom of anything, actually, a greater freedom of trade, a greater freedom of movement, and also a greater freedom of speech and printing. So all this freedom boosted innovation in Britain on various grounds. First of all, on the economic and technological levels, because the innovations of the 17th century were the factors of the start of a real industrial revolution that would change the world forever, and that would make Britain the richest and most influential country in the world during most of the 19th century. And this would start really during the 18th century through an impressive demographic and economic growth, and it will also translate itself at the international level about the fact that Britain soon had a kind of global domination of the seas, thanks to its navy, had the most numerous and globally spread colonies in the world, and also had the leadership on international trade and finance. But while there were all these economic improvements, there were also in Britain a feeling, an atmosphere of scientific progress and also cultural progress. And here we may refer to the fact that British universities, such as Oxford or Cambridge, and also what we call the learned societies, which mean organizations that used to promote research and knowledge, such as the Royal Society of London, well, all these institutions, they produced a great number of influential intellectuals, such as Isaac Newton in sciences. You may know that Isaac Newton was the formulator of the law of universal gravitation. Or in philosophy, John Locke, who was a philosopher who introduced some very important principles in politics. So we can have a look at two quotes from a famous book from 1689 called The Second Treaty of Government. In this quote, Locke says, "The state of nature has a law of nature to govern it." So here he referred to the situation of man outside of any society, man by definition, man in his states of nature. So a law of nature to govern it, which obliges everyone. And reason, which is that law, teaches all mankind that being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. So what is very important in this quote is that John Locke states that all men are equal and independent, so it means that they should be free, and that life, health, liberty, or property should be considered to be natural rights of men. In fact, John Locke is one of the inventors of the notion of rights of men in the 17th century. So that would prove very, very important in the history of the development of democracy. And another quote from the same text, no government can have a right to obedience from a people who have not freely consented to it, which they can never be supposed to do till either they are put in a full state of liberty to choose their government and governors. So here, John Locke is stating that any government should be based on the consent of the people who are governed. Any form of authority has to be accepted by the community who is governed. And so, Locke here is saying that a good government, a government that would have the legitimacy to give orders to its people, should be a government which has been chosen by the people. So it's an important step again in the development of the idea of modern democracy. And in fact, these ideas that we started to call the Enlightenment philosophy were pretty successful all over what I would call the Western world. So the west of Europe, and notably with many famous examples in France, like Voltaire, Rousseau, Diderot, Montesquieu, that we already studied in the lesson about France, but also in the other Western world, in the new Western world, which means the British and French colonies of North America. And here we need now to move across the Atlantic to have a look at what was happening in North America at the end of the 17th century. So it's part B, towards the US Declaration of Independence. So contrary to what I've just said, most of the events that I will present in this part are from the late 18th century. But during the 17th century, Britain very intensively and successfully colonized North America, leading to the creation of 13 British colonies on the east coast of North America. You can see them on the map here. I would define a colony as an overseas territory that has been conquered, exploited, and dominated by a foreign power. British emigration to these colonies had been encouraged. It means that many people from Britain had emigrated, had traveled and settled in North America in order to start a new life there and to run some businesses. So in fact, those colonies in North America were what the British called the colonies of white settlement. It meant that some white European population had settled there. And in this process, another thing that had been exported to North America as well was the British political model, because each of these colonies was self-governed. It had to remain loyal to the Crown of England, but each colony had its own local institutions, often with a governor and a chamber of elected representatives. So in fact, the political system that was created in most of these colonies was pretty much liberal, inspired from what was happening in Britain, where the elite of property owners could elect its representative in a chamber and take part in government. Yet there was a problem in this system, and that problem was that the 13 colonies were not represented by any MP, any member of parliament, in the British Parliament in Westminster, London. And in the second part of the 18th century, tension rose, because Britain had fought a war called the 7 Years' War, which had been very costly to the government. And for that reason, Britain imposed new taxes on its colonies of North America. And these taxes were largely rejected by those that we may call the colonists, so the former European people now living in North America. On this cartoon, you can see a crowd of people who is bullying a custom officer of Britain who has been covered by tar and feathers and so it's a humiliation. And the reason why is that they refused taxation, and they refused the taxation from Britain. In the background, you may see a tree of liberty, so that's a symbol of rebellion, of people that protest in favor of their liberty. And turned upside down and pasted on the trunk of the tree is the document about the Stamp Act. So the Stamp Act was a law from Britain that had been imposed on the colonies, which introduced a new tax because you had to pay for stamps and put them on many documents for trade. No matter what was in detail that kind of law, but what is clear is that any new law introducing a new tax in the colonies was increasingly rejected. Those famous laws are, for example, in 1764, the Sugar Act, which increased taxes on sugar, the Stamp Act of 1765, and this was an important step because the next year, some people in the colonies who rejected these acts, took direct action, and they decided to organize a boycott on British products. Okay, they in order to have the British government changing its law regarding taxation, they organized the boycott on British products, which means that they refused to buy British products. And in fact, their political movement and their political demand was based on one essential British principle in politics. And that principle is known as no taxation without representation. That motto, no taxation without representation, was already the motto of the nobles who had created the British Parliament much earlier in history. And they used to reject the supreme authority of the king then. So here there was more or less the same kind of demand, but in the colonial pattern. And you had the colonies who refused taxation by Britain as long as they were not represented in the British Parliament. And so tension rose every year in these moments. In 1770, an event known as the Boston Massacre took place. There had been a demonstration against British rule, and some demonstrators had been killed by British soldiers. So the British Army had killed some civilians living in the colonies, and that event was largely used by the political activists that blamed Britain for their propaganda. Another very famous event that is seen as one of the starting points of the American Revolution is the 1773 Boston Tea Party. So what this famous phrase refers to is an event which was a protest against the British taxes, and notably against a law that compelled the Americans to buy tea from the British East India Company. You remember maybe, maybe in second, I've never mentioned that, I believe. But the East India Company was the British company who used to trade many things in India and China. And it became quite a global company. It tried to sell its tea in North America. And the British government demanded that only the tea from the East India Company should be bought by the people living in North America. They refused that, and they took a direct actions really, because a group known as the Sons of Liberty went on the ship of the East India Company and threw the chests of tea in the harbor of Boston. Famously, some of them were dressed up like Native Americans in a way to assert that they felt more American than British. So from this moment, you had really a divided society in the colonies of North America, with the opponents to British rule that named themselves Patriots, and who were opposed to those who remained faithful to London and the British Crown, who called themselves Loyalists. And the next step in this growing trend of tension took place in 1776. On that day, in Philadelphia, representatives of the 13 colonies met, and it was the second time they tried to unite in a way, and they met in a congress. And on the 4th of July, they signed a text which is one of the most famous texts in world history, and that text is the United States Declaration of Independence. It was written by some men who were really inspired by the Enlightenment philosophy, who were really members of the North American elite, North American elite of European origin. People that were property owners, people that were rich, and many of them had slaves, for example. But according to the principles of Enlightenment, they refused the rule of Britain. Among them you had Benjamin Franklin, for example, John Adams, who became later the second president of the USA, or Thomas Jefferson, who became the third president of the USA at the beginning of the 19th century. And they wrote this text whose introduction is very, very famous. Here are some quotes from it. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bonds which have connected them with another, they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. So here it is the announcement that reasons for the Declaration of Independence will be listed, and you can see that the signatories of the declaration consider that there is a North American people which should form a nation and separate itself from Britain. So here are some causes. We hold this truth to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So here you have the reference to the rights of men, the rights which are considered to be unalienable, which means that nobody can take them away from you. And life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness have become a very important motto of the American political tradition. So it's a clear reference to John Locke's ideas of natural rights of man. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So another principle from Locke, the idea that any rightful government should be based on the acceptation of the people who are governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute a new government. When a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty, to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. So in this last paragraph we have the idea that if the government is not based on the consent of the governed, if the government is trying to impose something that the people don't want, then the people have not only the right but the duty to make a revolution. So that's very clear. You have three principles inspired by Locke and the Enlightenment: the natural rights, the government based on consent, and the fear of tyranny and the right to revolution. So that Declaration of Independence is probably the most famous date in the history of the USA, because the 4th of July is still a national day nowadays in this country. In fact, a war of independence between American insurgents led by General George Washington and Britain had already started in 1775, and it would last until 1783. So you call the people that rebelled against Britain the insurgents, and now they had taken arms and were really fighting some military battles. You can see on this map some the names and location of some famous battles of the American War of Independence, like the Battle of Bunker Hill, of Lexington, or Saratoga, for example. And what is interesting is that the insurgents received a vital financial and military aid from France. Even though France was led by an absolute monarch, Louis XVI, but France used to believe that anything that was done against Britain was good for France. And so even though the American insurgents were promoting a political doctrine that had nothing to do with the ideas of King Louis XVI, well, King Louis XVI, he nevertheless helped the American insurgents against the British. Those paintings have been done after, but they are famous symbolic illustrations. Here you can see General Washington crossing the frozen Delaware River during the war. And here a very important character for our studies, because it's the French general that was leading the army sent by King Louis XVI, and that's General Lafayette, who would play many different roles a bit later in French history. So he went to North America to fight against the British alongside the American insurgents, and you can see on the right of the painting the former US flag with the stars, the yellow stars on the blue square, and the red and white stripes, so the stars and stripes flag, extremely famous. This War of Independence was a success for the USA. But when the war stopped in 1783, there was still no real agreement among the 13 colonies on what kind of regime they wanted to create. Each of the 13 new states, because now they were not colonies anymore, but states, each of these states wrote its constitution, often with a rather liberal doctrine, of course. But in 1787, the decision was made to create a federal state that would exist above each of the 13 states, in order to coordinate the policies of these states and form one single sovereign independent state at the international level. And that country would call itself the United States of America. So the 1787 Constitution is a very, very famous and important political text in world history, because it still is today the oldest democratic constitution ever written, and it is still used today. The USA still live under the rules that were set up in 1787. Even though I said it was democratic, this is an adjective which is very debatable. We'll see that in a couple of minutes. What is remarkable in the US Constitution is that it formed for the first time in a large territory a federal republic, which was very unusual in those days. It was federal because it was a federation of states that kept a large autonomy, which is still the case today. You may remember that you have some states in America who use the death penalty, and in other states it's totally banned. So a federation and also a republic, as the head of state would not be a king, but an elected president. And in fact, the first president was General George Washington, elected in 1789. And what is also very remarkable with the US Constitution is that it was based on a really strict separation of powers: legislative, executive, and judicial. So the legislative power was given to a Congress divided into two chambers: the Senate, representing the states, and the House of Representatives, who represent the citizens of the USA. Executive power is in the hand of a president, and judicial power is in the hand of the Supreme Court. And in fact, you have a complex system in the USA that still exists today. They call it checks and balances, which results in the fact that each of these three institutions is at the same time independent and controlled by the two others. And the goal of this is to avoid tyranny at all costs. You have in the USA a double separation of power. Separation of these three essential powers that you can see here, and also the fact that power is being separated between the states, each state having its own laws, and the federal state, with the capital city Washington, which would be chosen in 1791. What this illustrates is that the USA have a political tradition of fear of big government. Okay, they don't like the idea that a government may become too powerful. They saw it as a danger for liberty. Even though the US political regime was more liberal than any other major political regime at that time, it was yet far from democratic, as suffrage was not universal. Poor people could not vote in the beginning. Women were totally excluded from the vote. And the legal system was based on the principles of racial discrimination. As illustrated on this painting, which shows the farm owned by President George Washington, slavery was not abolished, and so black slaves had absolutely no rights. Former slaves that had been freed were denied complete citizenship, and the Native Americans, the population that were present before the European colonizing North America, well, these Native Americans were considered to be foreigners, and many wars between the USA and the Native Americans would take place, ending up in the almost total destruction of the native people. If you want a proof of this, of this essentially racist basis of the birth of American democracy, you can have a look at these quotes from Thomas Jefferson before he became president. But you can see what was the background of the people that founded America, of the founding fathers. I advance it therefore as a suspicion only that the blacks, whether originally a distinct race or made distinct by time and circumstances, are inferior to the whites in the endowments both of body and mind. This unfortunate difference of color and perhaps of faculty is a powerful obstacle to the emancipation of these people. And by emancipation of these people, Jefferson meant the fact that these people could be freed from their status of slave and given the same rights as the whites. So you see, even a man who was pretty advanced and open-minded regarding politics as Thomas Jefferson was affected by the prejudices of his time, racist prejudices of white people, and an economic system where slavery was seen by the rich property owners as something necessary for their economy. Nevertheless, in those days, in the in the end of the 18th century. What had happened in North America was very important to the elite of Western Europe, and I would call not all the elites, but everybody knew about that, but some people that we can call the Enlighted people, the people who were attracted by the ideas of Enlightenment and the ideas of political reform. Well, they were very impressed by what happened in the USA, even though that country was not as important as it is to be. There were only a couple of colonies far away on the other side of the Atlantic. But what had happened in North America was that the ideas of Enlightenment philosophy had been turned into a real political regime. And that would be a source of inspiration for those who, in France in particular, wanted to put an end to absolute monarchy. And clearly they took the USA and the British model in general as an example. And I chose to illustrate that, the fact that Benjamin Franklin, as an ambassador, was present in France in the late 1770s, where he received a very favorable welcome, and where his ideas and his testimonies about what was going on in the USA certainly inspired many people that later would be supporters of the French Revolution.